One of the things about me that surprises no one who really knows me is that I have an absolutely raging case of ADD. And that was not that funny. I'm keeping track of who I need to excommunicate after things are over. But no, I really do. And one of the aspects of that has been, shall we say, enhanced with age is the increasing ability to go into a room to find something, and upon arrival, forgetting what it was I went in that room to find. Now, sometimes I can restore order by going back to where I was when I decided I need to get up and leave and search for context clues. And I can see something there on my desk that says, oh, I was supposed to get up and go do that. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't at all. But here's what I'm also learning. I'm learning, as much as I'd like to blame this on ADD or on getting older, I think the more likely explanation is that all of us, ADD or not, aging or not, spend most of our day on autopilot, just doing instead of thinking. So it's very easy for things to fly in and out of our consciousness. We do Monday things because it's Monday. We do Tuesday things because it's Tuesday. And we do Easter things because it's Easter. You got up this morning, you got dressed, maybe did some Easter basket traditions, maybe took some pictures, and then you got everyone together, more or less happily, and you came here this morning because those are Easter things that you do on Easter. That's in the programming. But what is it that you came here to this room to find today? I mean, do you even remember? The passage from the Bible book of Luke that one of our elders, John J.T. Thomas, read for us earlier, paints for us a picture of people on autopilot. Now, to be fair, they were on grief-induced autopilot, going through the numb motions of losing a loved one that all of us have found ourselves to be in or will someday find ourselves to be in. The women who had attended Jesus' placement in the tomb on Friday were coming back after the Saturday Sabbath to do the work of preparing Jesus' body for the next year. Because you see, in the culture of the time, a body was placed in a tomb on a slab to decay for a year until only the bones of the deceased remained. And the bones were then collected and placed in an ossuary, a box whose purpose it was to contain the final remains of the deceased. And then this bone box, this ossuary, was put in its final resting place in the tomb because that allowed others in the family to be able to use the same burial spot. So the spices that the women were bringing weren't for mummification, which I think we tend to believe they were. Instead, they were aromatics and they were perfumes to mask the scent of decay, because that's what was expected. They were on autopilot. This is what the programming called for. And in this drone state, the women had forgotten what it was that they should have been looking for when they went to the tomb that morning. So the angel reminds them by asking the question, why do you seek the living among the dead? You see, part of the autopilot that navigates people to attend worship services on Easter is to revisit a story that has no real life to it, at least for us personally. For some of us here today, Easter's resurrection is simply a metaphor for new possibilities, opportunities for renewal, a metaphor for spring. It's just a story with meaning, certainly, but with only slightly more meaning than Greek myths or Aesop's fables or a favorite book from our childhood. It's just what we do on Easter Sunday. So there is a sense that some of us came here today with the living to seek the dead. to join others to culturally touch the story of Jesus for another year, who is no more alive for you than, say, George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. And just as the women that morning were surprised to find the stone rolled away and the tomb empty, you're mildly amused, maybe even surprised in this modern age that there are people around you here today and a guy talking to you who believe that it all really did happen. So why should you have come here today, if that's you, to seek a living Jesus and not a culturally important but personally lifeless story to remember because it's Easter? Because of what Jesus taught concerning himself. If I were to take a straw poll here this morning, I'm all but certain if I asked you to summarize the teaching of Jesus into one sentence, that you would come up with a sentence that was reflective of his moral teaching or his ethical teaching. Love your neighbor and all of that. That's what Jesus taught. But that wasn't his primary subject matter. His primary subject matter was himself. He primarily taught about himself. So the starting place for coming into this room to look for the living Jesus this morning is to remember what he taught. That's the reason that the angels say to these women seeking a dead Jesus, remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and crucified and on the third day arise. Remember that? You see, the angels are referring to an event recorded earlier by Luke in the Bible book that bears his name. In chapter 9, Luke tells us that after miraculously feeding thousands of people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes in Galilee, that Jesus sat his closest 12 followers around him, his disciples, and had a conversation. And the vibe of that conversation was something like this. Jesus saying, hey, so let's talk. You've just seen me do a pretty amazing thing, and I've done several amazing things that you've seen accomplished. You yourselves accomplished some pretty amazing things in my name when I sent you out to preach of me. And no less than Herod himself, the Roman appointed king of the Jews, has himself wondered who I am. So tell me, what have you heard? And they report to him the speculation on the streets. Well, we've heard people say that you're a resurrected prophet of some such, but they had to know that the next question was coming. In Luke chapter 9, verse 20, he said to them, but who do you say that I am? You can't hide behind others anymore. I don't really want to have this conversation with you because I need to know what other people are thinking. I need to know what you're thinking. Who do you say that I am? And Peter answers, the last part of verse 20, the Christ of God. When Peter answers the Christ of God, it means that he has processed everything that he has seen and everything that he has heard of Jesus since encountering him as a fisherman along the Sea of Galilee, that he's filtered all of that through his understanding of the Jewish scriptures, and he's concluded that Jesus is the God-promised Messiah. Christ is simply the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. Peter is saying, you are the one that we have been taught since we were children to look for. Now, if you give the right answer to your parents, you expect your parents to be super excited for you. Yay! That's not what Jesus does here. He does something actually that's quite strange. It's recorded for us in verse 21. He strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one. You've just deduced the most amazing thing in Jewish history, Peter. Be quiet. I mean, think about that. Think if right now, today, someone came up to you and said, I can tell you with absolute certainty who's going to win the Super Bowl in February. But don't tell anybody. Not a chance. There's not a chance that we would keep that kind of secret. What if you've been told the greatest thing ever? Do you think that you would be able to keep that secret? Not a chance. So why would he tell Peter not to tell anyone? Because he had the right answer, but he didn't know what it meant. For Peter, acknowledging Jesus as Messiah just simply meant happy days are here again for the Jewish people. He and the others thought that the Messiah was a political and a military leader who would defeat Rome and lead Israel to geo-global supremacy. But Jesus knows something that they didn't. And so in verse 22 of chapter 9, he says, the Son of Man, this is what the confession means, Peter. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. For Jesus, this is what it meant to be the Messiah, to be crucified and resurrected. And this is the teaching that the angels are saying. Do you remember what he told you when he was with you in Galilee? And so they came with the living to seek the dead that morning, and not to seek the living among the dead. And that is part of the reason that some of you have come this morning, to connect with a traditional story, but one that is not functionally true for you. It is a lifeless custom, but it's not a life-giving connection. You really don't know what Jesus taught. It wasn't just love your neighbor and be kind to one another. It was that I am God's promised Messiah to atone for the sin of the world and to prove it by my resurrection. The data increasingly shows that while the vast majority of Americans believe that Jesus was a real historical person, most of us believe him simply to be an inspirational person and nothing more. That's why it is so easy in our culture to make Jesus the mascot for any and every cause or movement social media or politics shoves upon us. We've forgotten what he says. And the scriptures record over and over again that he came to inaugurate a kingdom in his name, whose citizenship test requires us accepting that only his blood can pay the price of the offense for our sin, and only his resurrection can prove that the price was paid in full. If you came here today believing none of that, I'm glad you're here. I really am. But you've come doing Easter things because it's Easter. And if that's you, let me challenge you with this thought. A living Jesus changes everything. If the resurrection is true, then what Jesus said about his mission being one of establishing a kingdom and making citizens of those who trust in his death to cover their sins and trust in his resurrection to prove it worked, if that is true, it changes everything about the world. It changes everything. That is why Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So, it all depends on whether Jesus rose from the grave. It all depends on whether Jesus is alive. So did he? Did Jesus physically rise from that slab meant to hold his decaying body for a year and emerge from the tomb? I believe he did. I believe he did in part because the scriptures, the Bible, are authoritative for me. I believe what they say. But if you don't accept the Bible as authoritative, is there anything else to which I can appeal that would maybe get you to thinking this really did happen? Let me give you 3 things to just think about. First of all, the tomb was empty. That is verifiable. The reason that there is debate in Jerusalem in the days following Jesus' resurrection is because it was verifiable the tomb was empty. The only thing going on in Jerusalem were people trying to offer explanations as to why it was empty. If it weren't empty. You could walk people to the tomb and say, he hasn't risen. Clearly, he's right here. So the tomb was empty. That's what they're arguing about. Second, Jesus was seen. The scriptures record that there were hundreds of people who saw the risen Jesus. Arguments that they didn't really see Jesus tend to kind of congregate around the idea that they were hallucinating. But hallucinations require an expectation or a desire or a hope to see what is seen. And while most witnesses would have desired or hoped to have seen a risen Jesus, like you and I would hope to see someone that we loved who has passed away, not all hope to see this. In fact, James, his brother, was a skeptic. And Paul was an avowed enemy of Christ and Christianity, believing it to be an existential threat to everything he believed. And both died, attesting to having seen the risen Jesus, which brings me to the last thing I just want you to consider. The disciples were changed by what they saw. The disciples were accused, remember, of stealing the body and inventing a story. Well, let's just say that they could have somehow succeeded in stealing the body under Roman guard. Is it possible that they would have maintained, all 11 who remained, the same lie for years and then die for it? You know, Ben Franklin famously said that 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. I mean, do you think 11 are not only going to keep the secret of all secrets, but die for it? So I think the preponderance of evidence shows that what the angels told the women that morning was true. He is not here. He has risen. And that changes everything. And my prayer for you this morning is that it will change you if it hasn't already. And here's how that can happen. That avowed enemy I referenced earlier, a man named Paul, whose life was changed by encountering the resurrected Jesus, wrote these words in the Bible book called Romans. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. For the scriptures say, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. All that is required for this to become not a lifeless story that you touch every year, but the controlling narrative of your life, all that is required to be made right with God through faith in Jesus is to confess and believe. It's really that simple. But it's not as meaningless as I'm afraid many who claim to be followers of Jesus has made it out to be. By confess, I don't mean that we simply say some words. And by believe, I don't mean that we just simply have to be able to pass some kind of theological pop quiz. Instead, what Paul is saying here is that salvation comes from a public acknowledgement of a profound inner conviction. To confess Jesus is Lord is to declare that you have brought all of your life under the authority of Christ, and that you are willing to carry out his will for you to the degree that you concern it for the rest of your days. And to believe in your heart that Christ lives is to say that you are deeply convinced that a resurrected Jesus has the right to demand everything from you. And Paul is saying that these 2 things, confession and belief, declaration and conviction, work together to bring a person salvation. 48 years ago last week, on an Easter Sunday, a boy walked into a church in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And he knew all the Jesus stuff, and he knew all the facts, and he knew all of the narrative. But he began to realize it was more than just a story. It was true. And if it was true, it would need to change everything about him. So the degree that that boy could understand 48 years ago what it meant to surrender everything he had to this risen Jesus, he did. And he stands before you, obviously, today, deeply convinced that this changes everything. And my prayer is that it will change you today if it hasn't already. Would you join me, please, in prayer?